The Jimmy Olsen Radio Network.
Spinal adjustments provided by Dr. Chad Rolfson. The Spinal Tuning Chiropractic Center is a Des Moines area low flat fee per month unlimited chiropractic care practice. When life happens, just adjust. Schedule today at spinaltuning.com. Barbecue provided by Kenny's Rib Wagon, catering ribs for your pleasure and serving daily at Plaza Pub, 62nd and Douglas in Des Moines across from Merle Hay Mall. Find Kenny's Rib Wagon on Facebook. The thoughts and opinions of this program are strictly those of the host and the guests, not necessarily shared by anyone in the universe, let alone shared by the host and the guest. Dimension, a measurable extent of some kind, such as length, breadth, depth, or height, an aspect or feature of a situation, problem, or thing. Fear, an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain or a threat. Knowledge, facts, information, and skills acquired by a person through experience or education, the theoretical or practical understanding of a subject, awareness of familiarity gained by experience of a fact or situation. Imagination, the faculty or action of forming new ideas, or images or concepts or external objects not present to the senses. The ability of the mind to be creative or resourceful, the part of the mind that imagines things. A dimension, vast as space and is as timeless as infinity, between light and dark, somewhere in the middle of science and superstition, lying between fear and knowledge, the dimension of imagination. Welcome to the Daily Planet. I am Jimmy Olsen. Joining me again is PJ. PJ, how's it going, buddy?
Very well, Jimmy.
You having a good week so far?
I'm having a great week. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Last week was a little iffy, so we weren't able to get one of these things taken care of. So I know I sent you the idea last week, and then we didn't get it done because, you know how we get old, so you start dealing with migraines and headaches and all that stuff. It's always a fun thing.
If you say so. How about that?
Oh, are you saying you don't have them yet? Is that what it is? Are you getting?
I'm just saying rest? I'm not that old.
Well, all right. So the idea that I threw out is the whole reboot and remakes, and we know what those are, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you're familiar, and I know one of the latest ones that they did was Walker on the CW with Jared Padalecki. Did I say that right? Is it Padalecki? I think so. I don't know. Close enough. I mean,
I've never heard anyone say his name, but I've read it, and I know the person you're talking about.
Right. He was part of. He was in Supernatural. They did 12, 13 seasons, something like that, which just wrapped up last year. And then this came out kind of out of the blue, and it just kind of made me the first thing. And this is going to be the first thing that I pose to you, and maybe you can come up with the reason for this. So the first thing that popped in my head is how today. And maybe it's because it's just some new thing with the kids now. They call everything reboots. But when I was growing up, and you weren't too far off, I mean, you're a little younger than I am. Right. But they so back in the 80s, they were remakes. Mm-hmm. I mean, difference. Can you explain that?
So as best as I can tell, and I've done just a minimal amount of nosing since you told me this is what we were up to. The term reboot for fiction, right? It's borrowed from rebooting your computer, right?
Well, right. And to me, a reboot would mean you're actually it's the same idea, but you're completely rebooting it and doing it completely and kind of almost a different storyline. That would be my thought.
Yeah. So it first gets used on Usenet, like so many things that unfortunately came into the culture. Right. But it first gets used for fiction on Usenet in the 1990s, and there's debate about what it initially means. But the way the person describes it from that is they talk about what's already become common practice in the comic world.
Okay,
which is where periodically, often every 10 or 12 years, right, comic series will run to an end, and they'll restart with a new issue number 1 to start retelling the same story, recognizing that at a certain point you sort of exhausted the storyline as it exists. And this usually happens when a new writer would come on. And so they applied the computer term to comic book stuff, which then got applied to films.
So basically, so what we would know as a remake, because you're kind of remaking the whole thing, they just retermed a computer term which kids would be more familiar with, and that's why they started using reboot rather than a remake.
Right. So there are there are three terms that are related here, right? There's reboot, remake, and revival. And revival is the way, which is funny, right?
That is.
Revival is not used much anymore, but that was originally the distinction that would be used in print was a revival was for television, and a remake or a reboot would be used for film. Now that distinction has been largely kind of lost, but the idea behind it was that a revival, much like you have for musicals too,
sure,
the revival cast of whatever, it's not actually doing a different show, right?
They're continuing. Because a revival is they're continuing the story from where either it left off, or like say, let's use Beverly Hills 90210. So they called it a reboot, but it wasn't really a reboot. It was almost like a revival because just retelling the story with some of the original cast members as the parents now.
That's right. So you have these sort of nods or homages to the former to the former series that are built in, but it's not intended simply as a sequelized, right? It's not a serialized, like this is like episode 37 of the same story.
Sure. Right. Which, and of course, another one is Saved by the Bell, which they did the reboot on Peacock, which of course you heard Dustin Diamond just.
Yeah, that was, yes. Yeah, I did. And, God rest the poor man's soul. He went very, very quickly.
It was 3 weeks ago when they basically diagnosed him with was it stage 3 or stage 4 cancer?
Right. And he just went. I had a brief encounter with Dustin Diamond back in probably 2002.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. We need the story.
Well, it wasn't real pleasant, and I don't want to speak ill of the dead. But he came to Dubuque to do a show when I was in college, and it didn't turn out great for Dustin or for the people that were at the show. But
I've actually heard that more than once with most of his shows. After Saved by the Bell, and then he kind of fell off, into wherever he went, and then he came back with this whole comedy career. He was almost angry.
Yeah, it was a little bit like, because his character from Saved by the Bell was so particular. Well, and he played him remarkably well, right? He played
absolutely.
Screech. He was the the nerdy, geeky friend of the most popular kid in school, and I think he felt so hamstrung or typecast into that he thought he had to differentiate himself or whatever. It's a little bit like Bob Saget,
right? Exactly.
Full House thing.
If you see Bob Saget live compared to Full House. No,
he had to become the filthiest comic in the world to break the sort of perfect dad type, right? And so I think poor Dustin did the same thing. I don't think it served him especially well, and I'm not like usually especially prudish with my comedy or whatever, but he just seemed like kind of a jerk. And I'm not saying that he was a jerk, but that his like onstage persona was sort of mean spirited, and that has a pretty limited kind of run. Like you might be able to get one show out of it, but then it's just like most people don't want to pay money to watch you be mean to other people.
Not everybody can be Andrew Dice Clay.
That's correct. That's a very good way to put it.
Or we can go way back and we'll find out who's listening that might really know some old comedians. Another one is Buddy Hackett. You've heard of Buddy Hackett.
Yeah. Sure. No. And I've watched things.
And he
was in history class.
He was in history class. So he was in a lot of Disney movies, especially Herbie the Love Bug. He was also in Music Man, but it was always this clean cut type of persona that he was playing because of the movies that he was in, of course, movies of that time. But when you went and saw him live, have you ever heard his comedy stuff?
No, that I haven't.
Oh, my.
Whole different thing.
Oh, absolutely. Almost like even Milton Berle. You see him on TV, and it's so family friendly, and then all of a sudden you hear some of his live stuff. I think at times I would almost say it would make a sailor blush. Just saying. But I mean, that's kind of where we're going. I mean, and what got me thinking in this whole reboot remake idea is because Walker was coming out, and I know we've talked, and you haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but I have
I've
seen the
not.
first 2 episodes. And then this week, I even noticed there was an article that Chuck Norris, because so the original Walker Texas Ranger, which the new one is just Walker, where before it was Walker Texas Ranger, but it was originally played by Chuck Norris, and he gave Jared his blessing for playing Walker, which is cool. I mean, I'm good with that, but I'm going, did he give him the blessing before he watched it?
You wonder sometimes. You do. Were you a fan of the original Walker?
I was. In fact, I never missed an episode of the original Walker Texas Ranger. I take that back. Probably the last few seasons I missed because I was working at night and we didn't have this, new fancy thing. Those digital video recorders, so you can, hold it forever. You were lucky if your VCR taped it back then.
Right.
But it was very action packed. I mean, you had Chuck Norris, who was an action star, and
right.
Black belt in
Mm-hmm.
in multiple martial arts, even the one, and of course now it's escaping me because he actually created his own,
right,
over the years, but very action packed. And I watched the new one, and you've got Jared almost playing the Sam character, so almost very timid in a way if you look in comparisons. So it's almost like his Sam Winchester character is now Cordell Walker.
He's now Walker.
And his partner does more butt kicking than he does.
So they kind of flipped it.
Yeah, they kind of did. It's kind of odd. And I don't know if this is the right way of saying it, but I mean, I guess I'll go with it. But it's almost like they politically correctified it.
Sure.
Yes, I created my own word because in the original Walker, so his fiance was murdered, and he just kind of went off the rails and basically had a death wish, kind of like watching Lethal Weapon, the first one with Mel Gibson and Danny
right.
Glover. His wife, died, and he basically didn't care if he lived or died anymore. So he just went out, with everything and started bringing in all these bad guys and really created a name for himself, almost like, watching Lone Wolf McQuaid, which he played a Texas Ranger back in the 80s that had David Carradine in it. But it was the same thing. So it was this real bad dude that you do not want to go up against him, and now we have the new Walker. And I don't know, maybe as it goes on, it'll pick up a little bit. I'm not sure. I'll still watch it. Not 100% sure how much of a fan I am at this point in time.
Sure. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind, right, is that there's a dynamic that happens whenever you try and remake or retell an existing story.
Right.
And that clearly a portion of what's at play now is that the remake has to distinguish itself in a real meaningful way from the old one. Otherwise, it just looks like a pale imitation of whatever everybody knows and loves and remembers, right?
Which is true.
So the CW did
right.
So the CW did a similar reboot of Nancy Drew,
right? Which I watched, and I actually like
it.
I like that.
It was very clever, right? But of course, the first scene of the first episode is Nancy having sex with her boyfriend, which never showed up in any of the novels, right? And so it immediately caused a lot of people like, "What
right.
You mean like Nancy Drew has sex with people? Like, what is that about?" I thought, but if you stuck with it, right? They played with many of the classic tropes. All the old characters are there, along with some new ones. It was, of course, reset in time.
Right. Well, two ways it was set in time. I mean, number one, it was newer, from where the old one was set back in the 70s. But two, she was like a teenage detective.
She was older.
In the books.
Right.
In this one, she's actually an adult. She has a job.
Right.
She's already graduated. So it's a little different piece of that.
Right. Which probably made some of the sexing it up a little more swallowable. But
which is what the
like,
CW does. They just sex it all up,
Right, they sex it all up. The same thing with Archie and all the rest of it. But the move here, right, is they're trying to take it's a custom as old as the Bible, right? You take a story everybody knows and you retell it for different purposes, and you want it to be evocative enough that people know what you're referencing, but you don't want it to simply be sort of bad copy of whatever the first thing was you were trying to do.
Well, and they also turn Nancy Drew into more, they're dealing with the supernatural, where in the original, she was this child detective, not, like the Hardy Boys, because that was all put together, which, Hulu even redid the Hardy Boys. They have their own season of that. But now, instead of her just finding bad guys, they're fighting ghosts and goblins and ghouls and banshees and keep going.
Well, no, it's so part of what drives this, right, is that when you retell a story, especially when you retell a children's story, you're necessarily going to be telling the story both for children and also for adults that knew the story as children.
Right. Well, almost like the Muppets, because the Muppets was actually written for adults, and kids ended up watching it.
Right. So that's a very good example. That's a very, very good example. So if you take sort of your childhood memories of the Muppets, which may not square with what actually was on screen, but your childhood memories of the Muppets, because you're absorbing it after the manner of a child,
right?
And then you go back and try and rewatch it. It's really jarring. You're like, oh, I didn't see that. Oh, I didn't know that was there. Oh, this is a lot.
Yeah, listen to all these innuendos that we were not, that we didn't notice as kids back then.
It's exactly. With something like either the Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys reboot, I think I did not read like all the novels, but I read several of both, right? And Encyclopedia Brown was kind of a slightly younger version of the same thing, but it was the child detective who's a sort of loose Sherlock Holmes character, who uses, with the Hardy Boys, they very deliberately, right? One was more sort of logical and methodical. The other was more sort of intuitive, and the way the two of them worked together made it play, right?
Right, kind of made Nancy, it work out, this team together, yeah.
That's it. And so and you do, like, it follows the pattern, right? You have sort of Sherlock Holmes and Watson type character. But in some ways, right, what you're saying with Walker is you're flipping the dynamic so that almost like Watson becomes the hero.
Right.
And the second becomes the first.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the, and I'm one of those, when you watch a reboot, is you don't want to go into watching this with any expectations. I do my best to go, this isn't the original. I understand that. But somehow on this one, I'm almost disappointed a little bit. And I'm not trying to be. By no means am I trying to be. I mean, because
you're allowed to be disappointed if you want to.
I kind of had a little. I guess I really wasn't sure what to expect, and so far, not really sure. I still don't get it. I mean, so is there a remake or a movie that you remember as a kid watching and then seeing a new one made that you think? Because I mean, this can go both ways. There are remakes that have been done where the remake was actually better than the original. Of course, then there's the flip way where the original, you can't top that. They tried and it failed, which we've heard with Ghostbusters so much because, of course, the reboot is they did it with women rather than with the original guys. Of course, now the rumor is they're going to do a reboot with all guys. So I guess it'll be interesting to see how that actually plays out.
So the question was, can I think of one that the sequel the reboot was better?
Well, I mean, is there one? Yeah, I mean, either better or even one that you saw the reboot and you were, you liked it, you were impressed with it, or you were disappointed. I mean, we could go either way with that.
So I think in the category of like worst reboot, or like on the list of worst reboot, right, would be the Ninja Turtles reboot from whatever it was, 2018 or something, the Michael Bay one. that was so bad. Anybody who'd seen the thing before, like people were saying, don't let your kids see this. It's just going to confuse them. Right. Because they sort of totally like this is the tension, right, in almost all storytelling, is if you're retelling a story or you're referencing a story that's already been told, you want to make sure that it's recognizable as the thing which came before. And so I'm enough younger than you that Ninja Turtles were kind of the main kind of childhood thing when I was.
I remember
up, right?
watching I watched the cartoon. I remember watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles,
yeah, right.
And then of course I saw the original movie that came out in the early '90s. Now here's something that was explained to me with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. We saw the original, which was kind of a twist of what the actual comic book was anyway. So it wasn't true. Where the reboot that Michael Bay did in 2018, that actually followed the story more true than what we saw originally. I mean, that's what I've read and heard.
Yeah. Yes, but, and I think this actually cuts right at the tension.
I like that. Right? Yes, but.
Well, so it, tonally, absolutely. The Bay film caught more of like the sort of grittiness and the hardness. The problem, right, with the Ninja Turtles as a franchise, right, was that the comics originally were very adult oriented. They were written for older teens and 20-somethings.
Right, absolutely.
And so they were gritty and they were rough and they swore a lot, and it was a whole different kind of a thing, right?
It'd be today's graphic novel.
It'd be like an adult graphic novel today, right?
Right.
And so it'd be like Die or Saga or something like that today.
Sure.
And so but then they sold the rights because of the toys, and they wound up making the cartoon based off of this idea for the toys, right? So they had to kidify it in order to commodify it. So then the story, and it's less like the content, because that's where all the fans really went nuts with Bay was, the original storyline out of the comics was what was preserved sort of in the theme song or the intro from the cartoon, right? Which was there was a chemical spill that caused these creatures to develop into mutants.
Except one of the turtles in the actual comic book was a girl. They weren't all four boys.
They weren't all four boys, and they were named differently. It was organized very, very differently. But the move was that they were mutants.
Right, exactly.
And of course, Bay tried to make them into aliens, which is just a different thing.
Sure.
And then makes the title sort of nonsensical, right? And so the problem is, right, what this does, it was the same kind of thing that happened with the Ghostbusters. There was a I think rightfully a lot of question about motives on this one, but when you retell the story, you always risk alienating the original fans, who are, at least in principle, some of the people that you want to have be behind the project, right?
Sure.
And if it gets too different, then people don't like it because it's not sufficiently the thing that they remember. But if it's too much the same, then people don't like it because it seems like a cheap imitation of what you remember.
Absolutely. So you're listening to The Daily Planet. I'm Jimmy Olsen with PJ, and we're talking reboots. And right now we're going through the whole Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle reboot that Michael Bay did in 2018. So you were saying the difference. Now, another one that you could see that was different, not meaning to interrupt, but it kind of like pops in the idea of Jumanji.
Right.
Where it was almost the same idea, but it was different because instead of it being a board game that came to life, they got sucked into a video game. It was almost like taking Jumanji and Tron and they slapped them together.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think this is where this dynamic of retelling the same story, cuts right to the heart of what you're trying to do. So Jumanji, right, originally wasn't even a game; it was a book, right? Mm-hmm. And the book was, of course, about a book. It was kind of like the never-ending story, right? Like it was a book about a book, and that's kind of the conceit, right? Is you're reading a book about people that enter into this game in a book, right? So that there's today we call it meta, right? Because there were two levels of remove,
right?
But of course, so then the first film's made, and you're dealing with that game. But of course, as time goes on, a video game is going to be much more accessible than a board game. A lot of kids today have never played a traditional style board game. So if you told the story using a board game, you've already cut out a large portion of your audience. They wouldn't know what the thing is.
Sure, absolutely.
And so you have to find ways of, like Nancy Drew being the Cub reporter. Well, we don't really use children that way. Or the Hardy Boys delivering newspapers.
Sure.
When's the last time a kid delivered a newsper, right?
What's a newspaper?
What is a newspaper to have delivered? Yeah, exactly. Be like the Hardy Boys. The Hardy Boys are Johnny Gosh, and they're the ones that got kidnapped and have to solve their own murder. So that might be a storyline idea. You should write that down. But that's what happens, right? Is you have to find another way of telling the same story, but telling it in a way that the people now can receive it.
Well, and another one that's getting kind of tossed around right now is the Breakfast Club.
Right. So what do you think of the idea of a Breakfast Club reboot?
I guess number one, it's what's their plan? I mean, is it going to be the same premise but newer? I mean, I guess I'm not 100% sure, and I'm not saying that I'd be 100% against it. I mean, I think it might be kind of interesting, but it's funny. So here's a funny story. So I read about that, and there was one of the actors, but of course, now that I go to try and find the story, it's like they erased it as soon as they put it out there because, we don't agree with everybody else. This can't be out there. But there was one that they had said, yes, you should do the reboot or the remake, but it needs to be done in anime. So not even live action. It needs to be animated. But then when I go back to try and find this story, when I brought this idea up to you to have the conversation about reboots, then all I find is basically the entire cast bashing it, except for one, Judd Nelson. He wasn't 100% against it, except the only way we could do it is if, you still had John Hughes around to direct it. But if there's no John Hughes, you can't do it. I'm like, well, yeah.
I think that insights. Yeah, I think that insight of Judd's really tells us something important, right? Because so the original story comes to life because of John Hughes's vision.
Sure,
it's not because of the particular performance of any of the actors or even the precise manner in which it was scripted, but it's the director's vision that kind of puts the thing on screen, right? And I think recognizing that if you did it now, it would just be a different thing. Might be a decent thing, but just be a different thing than what the first thing was.
Do they even have detention in school anymore?
It would be very hard. Especially like breakfast detention, right?
Right. Well, I mean, because I'm sitting here watching this, and of course, I mean, growing up, we didn't have where you had to go in on Saturday and you had detention all day. So that was something I wasn't familiar with, but I was familiar with the detention. I knew what that was. I knew your name getting written up on the board and you're staying after school.
Yeah, it like the behavior intervention club doesn't have quite the same ring to it. And like a principal or a disciplinarian, but you have like the school counselor trying to talk to them about their feelings and what's going on at home. It's not the same story, right?
They can give them Barney, and they all go get their own little personal Barneys that they can cuddle with all day, and they can start talking about their emotions and feelings. How does that make you? How does it make you feel?
How does that make you feel? You got it. Maybe you should write the script.
I think you and I can write this. We can create our own. We'll do our own little play for this. And so tell me, how does that make you feel when you punched your classmate in the face?
Now, have you watched any of the Disney remakes?
I'm trying to think. I'm sure I have. What is there any one in particular you're thinking? Well, like Aladdin. I mean, Aladdin. I did see Aladdin, which it was kind of the same but different, and it was a little different being live action and them having Will Smith in it. And I can't say I didn't like it. I mean, I thought it was actually pretty good.
Yeah, I enjoyed Aladdin.
He's no Robin Williams, but I mean, who can be Robin Williams? I mean, I'm sorry.
Well, that's that one's really interesting on several levels. The first one of which is right that the so even though the story is collected in the Arabian Nights, the original story of Aladdin is said to take place in China. And you know, in the cartoon, that clearly was just like abandoned. But there were references that were only audible, but there were references to China in the new one, which sort of made you pause. One of the things I think is interesting about the Aladdin remake is that, you know, Aladdin enjoyed kind of second life as a Broadway musical, the way a lot of the Disney shows have.
Sure.
And
either goes into Broadway or becomes Ice Capades. I mean, take your pick.
Right.
Yeah.
And the fellow that played the genie on Broadway was African American. Now, obviously, the original genie was not played by an African American; it was played by Robin Williams, right?
Right.
But
he was blue.
And he was blue. There was something about the character of Genie as black that apparently really appealed to people. Mm-hmm. And so then the casting of Will Smith and having this kind of vaguely hip hop version of the Genie seems to catch imagination. So it was a way to tell the same story or have the character, but have the character played and done very differently. And I think in that case, you know, it worked reasonably well. Right. There have been other versions of this where you redo characters, like with your Walker scenario, where it just doesn't hold as much. But the reason I asked about the Disney bit was because any of the like animated only ones that have been redone, like The Lion King or The Jungle Book or any of that.
Actually, so no, I mean, I haven't watched the new, no, I didn't see the remake of The Jungle Book. And of course, when they remade it, it wasn't even cartoon. It was more of the live action. I did see the remake of Dumbo, though, which again, they turned into the live action compared to the original that we saw that was a cartoon that had Michael Keaton in it. And I mean, that wasn't terrible. I mean, I didn't think it was bad.
Dumbo was pretty good. What struck me about it, about some of these, both Jungle Book though and Lion King, you know, have these long, you know, the bulk of the characters are animals. There are people like Mowgli, obviously, in the Jungle Book and whatnot. But,
right.
But you have animals talking, and it turns out having animals talking that look like real animals and not cartoon animals is slightly more disturbing than anybody thought it would be. And so when The Lion King, especially because I was the first one of these that did this, people were like, and it's almost a frame by frame reshoot of the cartoon, right?
Right.
There's extraordinarily little that's altered, except of course that they have to have different people play many of the parts because a lot of those people aren't alive or whatever.
Well, right. They're live rather than a cartoon.
Right. So now
not even using CGI.
Yeah, that's right. Just there.
Right.
And that makes for a very different sort of feel of the story, right? Mm-hmm. It's not so different than when you tell a story. You know, the difference between when you read a story on the page and when you tell it audio wise on Storytime. Right. It's not the same thing, right? It comes alive in a different way than it comes alive on the page. Sometimes things can come alive on the page because you can block things out. There's a visual element to it that gets lost when you're telling it in audio. Other times there's, you know, you can make things come alive with a voice that you could never accomplish on a page.
Which, FYI, Storytime is another podcast that I do that's pretty much all I do. I just recite old stories and stuff, which is, you know, it's been kind of fun, especially reading some of these old ones and how you can really play with it and have some fun. But no, it's no different than reading a book to your kids or to your nephew or niece when they're going to bed. I mean, it's the same idea.
Yep, that's exactly right. What's a reboot that you especially enjoy, Jimmy?
Well, you know, that's a fantastic question. Well,
you're not going to go all fuddy-duddy on me, are you? They're all dumb.
No, actually, well, I was going to say, I guess one reboot that we could call, which they actually rebooted it into a movie from the TV show, because I was the A-Team, which I watched the TV show front to back. I mean, I've seen every single episode. In fact, not only have I seen every single episode, but when they had it on Netflix before they took it away, I rewatched all the seasons.
Every episode.
I really did see it from front to back. But the movie I thought was actually pretty good with Liam Neeson and Bradley Cooper. I thought they did the movie very well, which again they upped it because in the original they were in Vietnam, and then in this one they all were in the Afghanistan war together. You know, the Gulf War. So I mean, I thought that one was I thought that one was pretty good. You know, I'm trying to think. I mean, right off the top of my head, it's like, what reboots have I seen? And I guess as I'm thinking back, it's more of the reboots that I saw were remakes of things. I mean, again, back in the 80s, there was a lot of movies that were done, which I didn't even know, that were actually remade from old 40s movies.
Right.
And I had no idea, which I guess that's another. Why is it that they make such, and it could be because of the internet, social media, they can't hide things like they used to, or they're, I would say, more transparent, but you know, I would be loosely using that word. But I mean, it's like they didn't make it. I just feel that they didn't make such a big deal out of it, that it was being redone. Then they tried to release the movie to stand on its own 2 feet.
Yeah, I think there's a dynamic. No, it's a great question. And I wish we had some sort of like real professional entertainment expert here to school you and me on this, because I'm just guessing.
We might have to find someone, because that'd be a good conversation.
That'd be a fun conversation. Here's my gut, just for what this is worth, is I think that before there used to be a much like darker line between sort of children's and adults entertainment. Like it was much clearer. And so like grown-ups were not, you know, your dad was not supposed to be nostalgic for the Lone Ranger. He might watch Gunsmoke or Bonanza, but he's not supposed to just sit and watch the Lone Ranger. Right. Whereas for all kinds of reasons, and you could probably psychoanalyze this, you know, delayed adolescence, grown-up, man, child, whatever. But like it is totally acceptable for like a 35-year-old man to sit down and watch a cartoon now in a way that it wasn't.
Right.
And because of that, if they'd done that 30, 40 years ago, it probably wouldn't have marketed well. But now, when everybody's okay with nostalgia, it's actually a marketing technique. Hey, this is the story. You enjoyed this as a kid. Now go show it to your kids.
Sure. Well, I mean, and it's not even just the kid ones that were remakes. I mean, another one that they just remade a few years ago with, was it Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper? And that was A Star is Born. Yeah,
Star is Born.
Which was done back.
Did you see that?
I have not seen the new one yet. I'll be honest. I have it recorded, but I haven't had a chance to watch it. But I did see the one with Chris Christopherson and Barbara Streisand, which, again, after the fact, guess what? That was a remake.
Right. That's right. No,
so a movie like in the 40s or 50s, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's right. And the story behind the original making of it is pretty tragic. But the move here. So I did see the new one, and I was pretty impressed. I'll happily admit that.
Which I heard, you know, the premise is the idea is the same, you know, dealing with, you know, substance abuse, and again the ending was the same as the beginning, you know, in the other one. So you still had, you know, with what happened at the end. I mean, I get this point we can just go. I mean, when the character died, just like he did in, I can't say original because the original wasn't the original, but I mean, so you still had the emotion and the feeling, but instead of it being alcoholism, it was drugs, if I remember right, in the new one.
That's right. So that story, you're right, has been told and retold, right? So you've got the 2018, right, with Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper. Right. And then you've got a 76, which is the one you remember with Barbara Streisand and Chris Christopherson. And then you have the 54, which is the one most people, older people remember, which is Judy Garland and James Mason. And then that itself was based off of a 37 film that is not as well regarded. And the thing that's interesting about this, right, is that sometimes that's what happens, is a story comes to life on stage or on screen, and it doesn't go very well. And then the people say, no, that's not what I intended at all. Let's do this again, but. And then it becomes a musical, or it becomes animated, or it was animated the first time and it becomes live action or whatever. Sure. But you change the medium to try and recapture the original idea.
Well, and I think like A Star Is Born, and again, so really with Barbara Streisand and Chris Christopherson being the third version of that, it was better than the previous two. It actually came out very well, and it was a lot better than the originals, or the original and then the original, however you want to label it. And of course, at that point, Chris Christopherson, though he had already been writing songs and made a name for that, because wrote a lot of Johnny Cash songs and different things. Mm-hmm. If I remember right, that was his first. Was it his first, or was that his second? Did Convoy come out before or after that? I can't remember now, as I'm thinking of it. But it was one. But it was early enough. It was one of his first movies that he did. I mean, that was like the breakout for Chris Christopherson. But I can't remember if it was Convoy first, and that was the first movie he had ever done, and then it was A Star Is Born, or if it was flip-flopped. I'll be honest, I can't remember exactly how that worked out. Which Convoy, love Convoy.
Yeah, Convoy's a great film. I'm 100% with you on that one. So the question is whether Convoy or
if Convoy was his first, or if A Star Is Born. But either way,
Star Is Born is first. Star Is Born is first.
So that was his breakout.
Right. He done some Sam Peckinpah kind of like B movies before, but that's the one that really.
Yeah, that was his first. Yeah, his first blockbuster, I guess you could label it as, coming out with him and Barbra Streisand.
The thing that like. I'm always astounded by Chris Christopherson, because apart from the music and the acting and whatnot, the guy's a Rhodes Scholar,
right? Yes,
like he went to Oxford,
right?
And if you didn't know this, you'd think he's like country bumpkin,
right?
And it turns out he's like smarter than Jesus, right? So it's a whole kit. Some people got it and some of us don't, but.
Well, right, absolutely. He goes to Oxford, does all this, ends up writing songs, and then all of a sudden now, well, hey, I've written all these hit songs, or even Janis Joplin, because he wrote Me and Bobby McGee, and then of course, a Sunday Morning Coming, was it? Really, I can't think of the title of the Johnny Cash song, but anyway, it doesn't matter, but. Oh, Sunday Morning Coming Down. And then all of a sudden now I'm going, you know what? Why don't I do movies? And then not only does he do that, he ends up in the Blade series with Wesley Snipes.
Uh-huh. Right.
He ends up in a Steven Seagal movie. He was the bad guy. And of course, I can't remember the movie right off the top of my head. It escapes me. But it was towards the end of, when Seagal was starting to, run out of juice with what he was doing before they all went straight to, I can't even say straight to video anymore. They went straight to Netflix. And I can't even use that anymore.
Straight to streaming.
Now it's like straight to streaming, because you can't even use Netflix because everything that they're doing on Netflix now. But I mean, they're in, I believe it was like in Kentucky or something like that. But I mean, talk about a guy that just reinvented himself over and over and over again.
And over again. Yeah, you're right.
I mean, it's brilliant. It's like one of those things is like, how could I figure out how to do that, to just reinvent myself? He rebooted himself.
Yeah, I was going to say he kind of had a career reboot. So maybe that's what you're in line for here, brother. It's gonna be you and me, PJ. We are the next big thing. The next big thing.
It might be somewhere in India, but we'll be the next big thing.
We're going to Bollywood.
Exactly. I don't know. There's just so much stuff out there, and there's still so much. I mean, I don't know. And there's always been the argument, too, that, Hollywood just can't come up with new ideas. So they just keep remaking certain things over and over again. I mean, I guess another one that kind of pops in my head really quick, that they did such a fast turnaround on it, which they've done that a little bit with, the Hulk and Spider-Man and things like that with in the comic book world. But even like the Fantastic Four, because they did the Fantastic Four, I can't remember exactly, but it was like in the late 2000s, and it was within 5 years later. It might have even been, after 2010, but I swear it was within 5 years they completely redid it again and then retold the story in a completely different way. And I saw it, and it to me, it was not as good as the Fantastic Four that I saw with the guy that played the Rock. He was the Commish.
Yeah.
I can't think.
I know the guy you mean.
Chiklis.
Yeah.
Michael Chiklis.
Michael Chiklis. That's right.
So, I mean, that one I thought was really good. And then the one that they did, like I said, just literally a handful of years later, I'm going, why did you even attempt this? Why?
I think, yeah. Well, I think the comic book thing, which in some ways this takes us full circle, right, to where this all even came from. So the comic book dynamic here is important in as much as, one of the things that's different with comics as sort of a genre is that you wouldn't ordinarily, like if you were telling a Sherlock Holmes story,
sure.
In some ways, Sherlock Holmes is very important to this whole thing too, because Holmes is the Holmes stories are the first time that the word canon, which usually gets attached to scripture, gets attached to other literature. It's one of the first genuinely popular series,
right?
And so people draw like a hard line between the original stories, what they would call then canon, and then the stuff that came after. And so, but what you wouldn't have clearly in anything that's like canonical Sherlock Holmes is you wouldn't have like a Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot crossover.
Right.
They live in different universes.
Right.
So Sherlock Holmes and Poirot, despite living in England and despite overlapping some amount of time, they don't meet each other because they're fictional people in different fictional places.
Sure.
But in comic book
they're literally
world,
in like different dimensions. Right. Absolutely.
That's exactly. But in comic book world, right, Batman and Superman clearly live in the same universe, and they even interact with each other,
right,
frequently, right.
In fact, they dislike one another. They hate each other,
right. But there's a relationship there
until they had to learn to get along so they could create the Justice League.
Exactly. But Superman and Wolverine don't live in the same universe,
right?
And so in some ways, right, what this is doing is,
of course you can't, because you have the DC universe and the Marvel universe.
Right, but this helps answer part of the Fantastic Four thing, right? Is that the original one in 2005 was right at the start. They're only just beginning to get this extended universe idea that these movies have a relationship with each other.
Okay,
right, and so this is part of what goes wrong with the whole Hulk thing and why James Norton sort of disappears and suddenly we have a different person playing Banner and whatever is because
when it went from, well, the first one was Eric Bana, then it went from Eric Bana to Ed Norton in the second one, and then it went from Ed to the guy that's playing Hulk now.
Right, exactly. But so they wind up switching these actors in part at least, and then changing storylines and adjusting. You tell a story different if your story is going to directly impact somebody else's story.
Sure.
And so that shifts how you have to it shifts what the character is for, what their own kind of arc is about, what kind of change you want to see happen in them in the course of the telling of the story. And sometimes that means retelling the old story so that you can do it again. It was a little bit like the Boxcar Children. Did you read the Boxcar Children books when you were a kid?
I did not read them, but I'm familiar with them because I didn't.
Well, so
reading when
much
I was
like your question about detention, right? so that they wrote these books in the early 20th century. They kept kind of retelling them throughout the 20th century, but they didn't get made into films until like the 2000s.
Sure.
How do you have a conversation about boxcars with children who've never seen trains apart from the subway?
What's a boxcar?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's a box,
right?
with wheels. Actually, you just said something that just kind of like triggered me for whatever reason in my brain, and the whole retelling of a story. So it's the same story being told over and over and over again, and we'll go back 200 years ago. when you didn't even really, well, it's going to have to be more like 1,000 years ago, when you didn't even have books. So it was me and you telling a story to someone, but it was us relaying that story of what we know of that story to children or to whoever it was. So it's kind of like, so this is PJ's version of
That's right.
Gone with the Wind. And then here's Jimmy's version of Gone with the Wind that I'm telling someone else. It's just retelling that story over and over and over again, but it's not always going to be the same because you have a different person telling it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in sort of professional storytelling land, which is a real thing, which is somewhat difficult to believe, but
yes, it is. PJ said he would teach me someday, because I actually I thought that would be fun. So quick story. We do like the Halloween stuff. They do the Halloween stuff. Well, not last year, but they do the Halloween at Living History Farms. And with that, there was a night that I was there. I can't remember. Of course, now I can't even remember what they called it. I mean, at Blank Park Zoo, it's Night Eyes, but they had their own Halloween thing there. But I was in, and it was in one of the in the barn, and there was a guy, a storyteller, and he was telling the tale of two cities, and talking about the heart just beating under the floor. I mean, it was just. Yeah, it was very cool. But anyway, so yes, so storytelling, a very true thing. In fact, they do actual, conferences that they come together and tell these things.
Oh yeah, there are graduate degree programs in storytelling like this. It's become in storytelling and folklore, it's become an important part of a lot of different sociological fields, because even something like the Bible, right? The way in which stories are told and retold in that kind of a context obviously has a lot of potential impact for lots of people, right?
Sure.
Depending on who you ask, there are 3 or 6 or 7 or 36 or 48, but like basic kind of core plots that are even possible.
Sure.
And that what we wind up doing is simply telling or retelling or retelling that story over and over and over again. And so in some ways, right, every monster story that we know, whether it's Godzilla or King Kong or the Thing or the Swamp Thing, is some version of Beowulf, right?
Right.
Like you've got a scary thing that we don't know sufficient stuff about, but it does bad stuff to us and our people. And you have a hero who's charged to go and kill the thing or end the thing, and he goes to do so, but while in the process of doing so, he discovers that the thing is really sort of tragic in itself. And so we learn that the things that we're afraid of, while they might be fearsome, are also pitiable, or something like that, right? And so you tell and you retell and you retell that same story. The thing that's interesting, though, about sort of oral cultures that develop these sort of seemingly core stories that drive the rest of us, is that in a written culture like ours, where memory retention is relatively small for most people, we imagine this going as like a giant game of telephone. So I tell you the story of Little Red Riding Hood, and you tell the same story, but it's not a big bad wolf, it's a big bad elephant. And then somebody else tells a story, and they heard the big bad elephant, and they know that the elephant's a Republican, and so then it becomes the story of the big bad Republican. And then somebody else, you see what happens, right?
Right. Well, it starts like Little Red Riding Hood and ends up Dracula.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is that in oral cultures where most of this stuff developed, their capacity for retention was much, much higher than ours is. And so they've done studies in places where the oral transmission of story is still what goes on. And the accuracy is stunning. There's a famous study that was done in the very beginning of the 20th century that was sort of overseen by W.B. Yeats, that was collecting stories in Ireland. And there were, 24 of these that were kind of classic stories that all the old people in Ireland knew, and everybody told their kids and their grandkids, right?
Sure.
And they went around and collected on wax cylinders oral copies of these stories from all over the country. They brought them back together and listened to them. and they were all accurate within like 3% of the word use.
Wow.
And
Seriously?
one of the things, yeah, right. And so one of the things that would happen is that if you messed it up, people in the audience would actually like shout you down and make you correct yourself. So the way that the oral storyteller tended to make the story their own was in the manner of telling, like the vocal the vocal projection and use of voices and all that kind of thing, gestures and or props. And that, so like, you know, if an old man's telling the story and he's got a pipe, then he can use that pipe in a way that a person without a pipe maybe can't. And if the pipe's lit, he might even be able to make a special effect, either with the smoke or the flame on the pipe, right? In a way that a person who's telling the story just with his cane can't. The person with a cane might be able to do audio effects that the person with the pipe can't. Right.
Exactly.
And so this process of telling and retelling and retelling stories, I mean, in some ways, you know, the best example of this, right, are the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. Like you've got four different retellings of many of the same stories, and oftentimes they look very close, and sometimes they look wildly different. And this need to kind of reboot story goes then all the way back to the 2nd century, where you have people who are making sort of gospels, snare quote, right, who are trying to retell the same story, but they wind up looking much, much different.
Right.
And so it's the same kind of move. And then in church history, you have it all over the place with the stories of the saints. People want to retell the story of the saint, but make it sort of fit for their day. And so you have St. George, the dragon slayer, who's Greek, but who somehow becomes the patron of England because as the story gets retold. Or one of my favorite examples, this is a much more contemporary one, but this I think really cuts at the heart of it, right, is when I was living in Ireland as a university student, I saw in a shop one day, I saw a statue of St. Martin de Porres. Martin de Porres was a biracial, mixed race mestizo who lived in Peru in the 16th century. But in this statue in Ireland, he was white with red hair.
What?
And
wait a minute, what?
Yeah, exactly. So I went to the shopkeeper and I said, "Who's this?" And she says, "Sure, isn't that St. Martin?" And I said, "Martin who?" Thinking that maybe there's some St. Martin in Ireland that I don't know about, right?
Sure.
And she says, "Martin de Porres." And I said, "Martin de Porres? Yeah, of course." And I said, "Why is he white?" and she looked at me like I was nuts. And she said, "What do you mean, why is he white?" And I said, "Well, he's a black guy from Peru. That's like his whole story is that he was black and they wouldn't ordain him because the superior was racist and the whole." And she looks at me like I'm nuts. And she says, "No," she says, "he's from down the road in Clontarf." So in the retelling of this saint story, they had recast him as a kid from down the street so that people would find him more attractive or more relatable. Now that's kind of horrible and racist. I'm not defending that, but you see how this happens, right? Is that when we take characters on to make them ours, we can, especially if they're historical characters, we can wind up doing a great injustice to people too.
And I'm sure that's not the only one. If we really were to dig through history to find retellings of stories that they changed it for their culture or where they lived to make it more theirs. I mean, you hear that even Christmas and Santa Claus and all the, St. Nicholas.
Of course.
It depends on where you lived, what culture was, on where he came from and what he did and why he is who he is.
Well, try this. I mean, right? Ask most Western people where the Buddha comes from, and most of their experience of Buddhas is in a Chinese restaurant.
Right?
Say, "Oh, Buddha's Chinese, right?" No, Buddha's from India. It just didn't take in India the way that it took in China. But all the pictures you see of him, he sure looks Chinese.
Right.
Now, of course, that's a very natural thing because the people in China, once they'd adopted the Buddha's philosophy, wanted to make images of the Buddha that looked like them, that they could relate to better, right? I was talking to a woman today. This was very interesting. It really struck me. So in Catholic land, I'm a Catholic priest. I don't think we said it in this episode, so just so people know. But
I was going to wrap it up at the end, but
that's
hey.
all right. So sorry for blowing
that's all right.
The smoke there. But so
there went the ending.
Yeah, it's all right. There's always this question about how we show pictures of Jesus and Mary and the saints, right?
Sure.
And of course, culture to culture, people often make Jesus and Mary and the saints look like, especially Jesus and Mary and people from salvation history look like them. There is something a little bit perverse about taking a person like from, like making Joan of Arc, from Arkansas or something. But anyway,
well, she's got Ark in her name.
She does have Ark in her name. So normally this conversation, especially today, given the struggles around racial justice in
Sure.
the country, people are talking about too many white depictions of, especially of Jesus. Well, what this woman was saying to me today was she visited a shrine in Wisconsin that I've been to, and the image of Mary that's there was made by the immigrant community that's up there, and she looks very different than most of them that we've seen because she is blonde-headed and blue-eyed and fair-skinned, and we might be inclined in our kind of contemporary
is Mary from Norway? Did I not know something?
No, but so here's the thing is so we might be inclined today to say, well, this is just feeding into the racial stereotypes and it's making things worse. And Mary was a dark-skinned, brown-headed Jewish lady, which is probably true historically, right? But
right.
But what this woman was saying, which I thought I wouldn't have thought of this, but I'm sure for some women is very, very important. She said, "Oh no, it wasn't any of that. It's that she was curvy. Like she's a rounder woman in this picture that was drawn."
Sure.
And most of the images of Mary are very, in order to desexualize the image, right? She looks like a 12-year-old boy.
Slender. Right.
But the lady that's telling me this is a kind of a bigger lady. And so she's saying it was helpful for me to see an image of Mary where she was kind of fat. And
which really, if you think, I mean, of course, we look many years later, but I mean, there was something about size being important because they saw size as being sexy. That's why when you look at a lot of these old paintings, that's why they were painting heavier people, because that was sexy. It wasn't the supermodel that we see today.
So, Jimmy, you and I were just born far too late.
Absolutely.
Far too late.
If we were born back at, in the 1200s, we would have been right on. Oh, you've been listening to The Daily Planet. I am Jimmy Olsen. And yes, he let the cat out of the bag. Father PJ, you've been, of course, listening to him for the past couple episodes. Always love having conversations with him. And I don't know, this reboot thing just popped in my head, and I thought we could have some fun with that. So if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it with others. You can do that on social media. You can follow Father PJ on social media where?
FRPJ McManus at pretty much all the places.
Sorry, was that a hard question? I didn't mean to catch you off guard.
No. FRPJ McManus on all the things.
I like that. On all the things. You can also find me on Facebook and Twitter. Just look up My Buddy Jimmy, or even on YouTube at My Buddy Jimmy 101. And you can even find the other podcasts that we have been chatting about as well. So thank you for listening to The Daily Planet. I am Jimmy Olsen. Again, if you enjoyed this, be sure to share it.
The Jimmy Olsen Radio Network.